Today, I'm going to try to explain Boros, which is Pendle's new protocol that allows you to long or short the funding rates of ETH and BTC. Now, it is very different from Pendle, and so explaining this is gonna take a little bit of unpacking, but if you stay with me, I think you'll be glad that you did. So let's just dive right in. Now, one of the first things you notice is that it is not Pendle. It is dramatically different. It's a standalone product that allows you to do a lot of different things and has a bunch of different mechanisms. The first is that you're not actually buying yield tokens or principal tokens. You're not buying the rights to the yield of an asset. You're not purchasing like a fixed rate, zero coupon bond with the PT. Instead, you're posting margin. So that's the big change. I think one of the big changes here is that you're not purchasing assets, you're posting margin to then get exposure to the funding rate or the implied fixed rate funding rate. Now, how does this work? Well, for ETH USDT, which is the ETH market, right? The ETH funding rate market, you would post WETH margin. And then for the Bitcoin market, you would post wrapped Bitcoin as your margin. Now, using that margin, you can then get exposure to YUs. This is the new primitive on Boros, which stands for yield unit. Now, one yield unit is the exposure to one of the underlying, so in this case, one ETH's worth of funding at the implied funding rate. So if you are, like in this case, right, I have one wrapped ETH's worth of margin. If I was using 1.4x leverage, it's another big difference here is that you can actually utilize leverage on this, which is kind of wild. If I was using 1.4x leverage and used 100% of my margin, I could get the exposure to 129 YUs, or the funding rate of 129 ETHs, which is kind of wild. That's a massive exposure. Also really good for hedging, which we'll talk about towards the end of this video if I have the brain power for it. But let's back up a little bit. So what's actually going on here? Now, I've started with kind of a tabula rasa or a blank slate on this chart so that I can show you what all the indicators are actually indicating. So this yellow line, which says latest, this is the mark APR, right? The implied APR or the implied funding rate on Boros. This is very similar to the IY on Pendle. It is the market on Boros pricing what they think the funding rate should be, right? Between the long book and the short book, this is where the market is currently pricing the funding rate on Boros. This is not the actual funding rate. If you wanted the actual funding rate, we have a few ways to look at that. I'm going to look at underlying APR real time first. Now, what this shows me is the real time funding rate on Binance. Now, one thing you may know if you're really big into, oh my gosh, we're almost at 4.6K. Sorry, I'm distracted. Holy smokes. Anyways, one thing you may realize or know is that the funding rate is variable. However, it only settles at the end of each period. So what I mean by that is between the funding settlement period, so it's an 8-hour period, between that 8 hours, the funding rate may go up, it may go down, it may bounce all around, but none of that matters. It works as an indicator of where the funding may end up being, but it's not actually what the funding is. So while you see these jagged lines up and jagged lines down, they're only showing you what the funding in real time was, not what it ended up being. And so if you want to know what the actual funding was settled at each funding period, then you would click Oracle. And so that line that I just added there, that purple line or blue, I don't know what you would call this, the line that is this one right here. This shows you the actual settlement funding rate for each period. And this makes sense, right? That's why it looks like it has corners and peaks and troughs and looks a lot more robotic than the last, because each one of these corners is a settlement period. So effectively an 8-hour increment. So it settled here, settled here, settled here, settled here, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the actual funding that was either paid or received on Binance to people who are shorting and longing ETH using that perpetual market. This is really important because this is the thing that matters. So for example, the yellow line, again, is the implied APR on Boros, and then this bluish purple line is the actual settled funding rate on Binance. So if you were locking in this yellow line, this implied APR right here, right? Let's just say this was 7.5%. This period, let's say you were longing, you would have paid 7.5% divided by 365 times 3, because that's how many periods there are. And you would have, per however many YUs you had as, a portion of ETH, and you would have received 10.95%, right, divided by 365 times 3 times your ETH on the position. So effectively, when you're longing the rates, right, that means you think the rates should be higher from now until whenever you close than the implied APR. So you think that this bluish purple line will on average be higher than the yellow line by settlement. If you intend to hold until settlement, you can always, of course, exit at any time. You can earn the yield positionally until you want to exit, and then you can just exit. That's kind of one of the beauties of this, is that you're not burning all of your capital with the YT to just get the yield. Rather, you're paying one rate, either the floating actual APR of the funding on Binance, or you're paying the fixed rate that you lock in. And so right now we see the fixed rate is at 8.98, which in my opinion is pretty dang high, because there's you see this wall, right, at 10.95%. That is 0.01% funding per period, per 8 hours. And that is typically around the peak that we see ETH and Bitcoin funding at. And if you don't believe me, we can go over to CoinGlass and just see the funding rate is 0.01%, even though we're in a crazy hot market right now for ETH. And if we go over to even Binance itself, you'll see that 0.01%. If we go over to the historical rates, you'll see 0.01% is the peak of the last 14 days. And even when it shot up here, it only hit that 0.01% and then kind of bounced around below it, and then went back up, hit that 0.01%, and then, of course, dipped a couple times below it. Now, this is pretty interesting, because that means effectively, if you could ever get really close to that 10.95%, which is that 0.01% annualized, it would be a great idea, in my opinion, to short that rate. Because if anything happened to the market stopped being super heated, we are likely to fall back down to these levels here. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say we are close to being really heated up. And of course, you could use different indicators for this if you want to take a position. If you didn't want to hedge and you just wanted to make a bet that we were hot and that the average funding was going to be below this, you would short the rate. Now, shorting the rate is where you pay the underlying, you pay this, and you receive the rate that you've got it fixed at. You're not paying the yellow line, you're paying the implied APR at the time that you lock it in. In that sense, it's similar to Pendle. So you could lock in 8.98%, and that's what you're receiving. You're receiving the 8.98% annualized, which means every period, I can just tell you, 8.98 divided by then 365 times 3, you would be receiving roughly 8.2 bips per period. And if you're paying 8.2 bips, right? And you're receiving, you're receiving 10 bips. Is that right? My goodness, 0.01. Yeah, you're receiving 10 bips. You're paying 8.2 bips. That would be the loss you're accruing times your YUs each period. Now, I've actually created a small little baby calculator for this to kind of really illustrate what's going on. But I want to talk about a few more things before we look at that. Now, one of them is that there is leverage. So the base leverage that you'll see when you first go onto Boros is just 1x, right? You're getting 1x exposure. And the reason why you can leverage is because you have margin posted that can be eaten into each period. The max current leverage is 1.4. So I'm going to go to 1.4. I'm going to be a little crazy with my ETH, and then I'm going to max short this just for fun, right? And it's not a ton of capital. And also, worst case scenario is not that bad. I'm going to show you why the worst case scenario is not that bad here in a second, and also how you can use this as a hedging tool. So yeah, close your eyes, because I know there's no dark mode on Sheets. You have to download an app, and I'm not going to do all that stuff because I use Sheets way too often to have any wonky user interface. So Google, please make a dark mode in the future. Now, as with all of my sheets, greens, actually, I usually do blue as inputs and green as output. I've done this backwards. Greens are usually outputs. Let's make those blue and let's make these green. There we go. Blues are inputs, greens are outputs. So if the average underlying funding, the actual funding in the next 43 days is 8.5%, and I get the fixed rate and I'm at 8.95%, you just saw I can get 129.3 exposure with my ETH margin of 1. ETH price, this is kind of inconsequential. I just added it there. For fun, we're actually at 4.6, which is crazy. Anyways, if I was longing, right, then my ROI would be negative, or my ROI would be negative roughly 0.07 ETH. Now, why is that? It's because every single period, on average, I would be paying the difference between these two things, which is, this 0.45% difference, right? Okay, so you can see here the difference is, I'm just going to do this minus that. It is 0.0004, and I could make it even larger into 4.1, right? So that's the difference. And so each period, I'm either receiving this percent of my ETH margin, or I'm paying this percent of my ETH margin, or paying this percent of 193. So actually, really, it's this times this, which is that every single period. So every single period, I am making or paying 5 bips, right? And so if I took the right side of this trade, which is to short the funding because it's higher than what the average is going to be, then I am making on average 5.3 bips per funding period so per funding period. And if I'm wrong, then I'm paying that. That's the long and short of it, right? And so this calculator just allows you to extrapolate what you think is going to happen. And that's why I like it. So here, if the average is 8.5 and the fixed is 8.95, I think it could be around 8.5, okay, so this is what I was saying. In worst case scenario, it's not that bad. Even if it was 9, right? Even if it was 9%, I'm only getting a negative 6.47% difference, and I'm, on my 1 ETH losing 0.007. If it's 0.95, I'm losing 0.08 ETH, which is, a pretty substantial amount. It would be a negative 8.3% ROI, right? If I could put these in as percentages if I wanted to. If it was peaked the entire time, I have a 30% loss effectively, really bad annualized APR. And people who longed this and they were just right, the market was going to be crazy hot for the next 43 days, they are eating very well, right? And so I am saying that I think that it is more likely to be the case that we're going to end up around 8.5. And that would be a nice ROI. It'd be a 14% ROI on my position, 122% annualized APR on my ETH. Now, I could be wrong, right? This is a bet, but if you look at just historical funding, maybe a way to go. The next indicator that I wanted to look at that I didn't show you guys yet was the underlying average. Now, if you look at the underlying average, you can kind of see that on average, since this market's been live 12 days ago, that the gold line has been higher on average than this kind of white line. Maybe it's a white pinkish line. And so shorters, people who are receiving the fixed rate and paying the variable rate, have been doing well. They've been the winners here. Granted, if you were to have longed and paid this fixed rate, then any time after here, you would have been winning, right? So there's a bit of a difference here, is that you get the fixed rate on this graph at the point you enter. So if you entered right here at 6.02, ever since 3 days ago, you have been on the losing side of the trade. That's really important to know. It is not as if when you short, you're getting the golden line wherever it is. When you short, you lock in whatever rate it was at that time. So if you locked in here, you're receiving 5.86% APR, and you're paying whatever this is at any given time. So I'm going to open up 25% of my position with a short rate, and it's that simple, right? It's super, super easy. Let's zoom in, go over here. You can see here, shorting the rate. I am now shorting 32.34 ETHs worth, which means I'm locking in this 8.98% that I'm receiving on 32 ETHs worth of funding. And then I'm paying whatever the variable is on 32.34 ETHs. So I'm paying the variable, I'm receiving the fixed. I think the fixed is pretty high. And I think when the markets are really hot, that's the time to short. And so I'm going to see, hopefully I'm not wrong. I'll refresh the quote. I'll short the rate. And that is margin. So let's see how the UI is here. Transaction submitted. There we go. It was that easy. Okay, that was pretty dang smooth, Pendle lads. So I've done it. Look at that. Barely even moved the market. So that is longing and shorting. Hopefully this makes sense. Now we're going to go over to vaults. What the heck are vaults? This is the liquidity for these markets. If you're in the vaults, you're providing full range Uniswap V2 style liquidity for these markets. Now, what's really important here is that you understand, because it's full range liquidity, you're exposed to the impermanent loss of full range liquidity, which is less than concentrated liquidity, substantially less than concentrated liquidity, but does still exist. And so it is not as if you're exposed to BTC USDT and that kind of impermanent loss. You're exposed to BTC YU or underlying APR or ETH underlying APR. So in this case, right, 142% APY, pretty nuts. Most of that APY is in terms of Pendle tokens. You can see here, you're getting a 97% APR in Pendle, which is kind of heating up right now. Pendle tokens doing pretty good, almost near all-time highs again. But then you're also getting 42% in organic swap fees. I mean, I just contributed to that, so you're welcome. Now, let's explain what you're exposed to. So let's go back to that market, back to ETH, and really understand that. So you are exposed to the value of this. So you can sort of think of this rate as 8.89% as a price, right? As a dollar value. And as it goes up, that's fantastic. You're having a permanent gain, right? Because if you're in an LP and the value of one of these things goes up, it means you have less of those things, which is fine. And now you have more of the underlying. So you would enter in, and now all of a sudden you have more ETH as that climbs and the value of your overall LP goes up. You're a happy camper. But if this golden number, right, goes down, now you have impermanent loss, because now it is dragging your ETH down. Now you have less ETH and you have more of the underlying that you're exposed to. And maybe you don't want that. So that's really what you have to consider when you are entering this LP. It's not that you're in like an ETH USDC LP. It's certainly not that you're just ETH Delta 1 exposed, just exposed to ETH. You're exposed to a full range LP between the underlying asset, in this case, ETH or WETH, and the underlying implied, it's not the underlying, the implied APR, this golden number over here. So that's really important to consider. Now, that's really it, right? That's all there is to do here. Okay, so let's talk about hedging. Let's say that you are an Athena protocol, or you're a Resolve protocol, or a Solstice protocol, and Basis is your game. But there are days where Basis works against you, and it eats up all of your APR, or in some cases actually gives you a negative APR, which eats into your principal. We've seen this with Resolve's RLP, where some days they've had a negative APR on RLP, which is eaten into the NAV of RLP. You don't want exposure to that, so this allows you to hedge against that. And let me explain why. Let's say that you have a 10 ETH delta neutral position and you're 2x leverage. What that effectively would mean is that your long, right? Your long is 46K. That's 10 ETH, 10 times 4.6, which is crazy to me that ETH is at 4.6K. But your long is 46K. Your short at 2x leverage will be 23K, but you are short 10 ETH, right? And so you need to hedge 10 ETHs worth of funding on the short. You're long, maybe you're getting the staking rate of 2.8%. You can leverage that if you want, but really let's just say it's 2.8%, right? So 2.8% over there, and then 10%, maybe you're getting 10% now, but let's talk about all sorts of different cases. If you wanted to hedge against, catastrophic funding rates, maybe going to negative 2% for a while, or even negative 5%, where now all of a sudden you're losing APR, what would you do? What would it cost you? Well, it only requires a 1/10 of an ETH. So your principal is $69,000, which by the way is how many ETH? So let's just do this divided by this. We'll make this 4.6K by the way, 4,600. So your principal is 15 ETH, right? You have 15 ETH's worth of principal. It only takes you 0.1 ETH to hedge your entire position, right? So you're hedging 10 YU, which is 10 yield units of funding exposure to ETH. It costs you 0.1, or it doesn't even cost you, right? It just takes 0.1 margin. And so here you have YU exposure, which is, whoopsie, 10. And so let's look at a few different cases. Let's say that you are crazy wrong, right? You're as wrong as could possibly be, and it peaks at that 10.95 the entire time, right? So for the next 43 days, it is maxed out at that line up here, and you were as wrong as could possibly be. What would you lose, right? You would have, so that's 10.95% the entire time. You made a profit of $745. You paid $108. So your net would be the difference between these two things. You still profited, oopsie, it should be plus, not minus. Done, you Steven. Your profit would still be $636, which if you annualize, which you can if you want to, which is this times, right, 365 divided by days out, and then divide that by the principal, which is this. You're still annualizing 7.8%. So you're not giving up that much APR, right? So you go from a 9.17 to a 7.83, but you were hedged the entire time. And also, it's not going to stay at 10.95 the entire time. That's an unrealistic expectation. Let's say more realistically on the losing side, it averages 9.25, right? It averages 9.25. So 9.25. So now it goes from an 8.03 to a 7.83, right? You lost $16. But you prevented yourself from catastrophic failure. Let's say it goes down to 3%. So ETH goes way down. Maybe 4% is more realistic. ETH funding goes down to 4%. We're sort of in a dead period. If you go over to this over here and look at the actual underlying, let's go over to the Oracle. You can see for quite a few periods, we were in 0 to 4%. So it's totally reasonable that we're in that 4% range. Let's see what happens, right? So at 4%, if you hedged now 268, instead of getting a net of 4.53%, an abysmal 4.53%, a T-bill yield in DeFi, instead you ended up with a 7.83% APR. That's a way better funding rate average for your protocol than that 4.53%. This is amazing. This is incredible. This is such an awesome tool for this very specific use case, which is also why I'm locking in that 8.95, because I think it's a pretty good time to do that. So if I wanted to have my 10 ETH delta neutral position, so 10 ETH long, 10 ETH short, and I wanted to hedge that, it only costs me 0.1 ETH to do that, which in my mind is absolutely crazy, absolutely nuts, and I love it. And there you go. So now you sort of hopefully understand what's going on there. Of course, you can boost your exposure to funding if you want to do the opposite. So if the rate, this is kind of more betting and less hedging. If the golden line went way down here to 4.25 again, and you said, you know what, I just want more exposure, you could put some ETH in here and long that rate directly if you wanted to get an ETH APR and then hedge that with your shorts and yada, 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 yada. But, you get the idea. There are many things you can do with this, and it's really exciting. And so I'm stoked about Boros. I hope you are too. I hope this wasn't too crazy long or too wild. Hope you understand a little bit more. Of course, go read the docs. My opinion actually is to click on the docs, copy the link, throw it in your favorite GPT or AI, and then just ask them a bunch of questions in very low level English, and they'll walk you through it and they'll help you understand. So thank you so much for watching. And of course, have a wonderful rest of your day.